Okay, good day to everyone. Good evening to those of you in Israel, and good afternoon or good morning to those in the United States and Europe, elsewhere in the world. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and this is the latest in our series of webinars building up to a special symposium that we're holding now on June 6th, a virtual symposium dedicated to the life and legacy of Menachem Begin, and that will be the day before the international premiere screening of the new documentary film about Menachem Begin upheaval, produced by the Hidden Light Institute, who we are very happy and proud to be collaborating with in this series. Let me start by wishing everyone celebrating a healthy Pesach starting in a couple of days. Also to Israelis on the call, I hope you're recovering from yet another inconclusive, seemingly inconclusive election. Let's see where we go with that. I think that you should view today's event not only as a fascinating event and experience in its own right, but also an opportunity to escape from the news about the election. Okay, firstly, I'd like to thank Sharon and Dr. Tashoff Burnton from Denver, Colorado, for underwriting the conflict resolution portion of the Begin Symposium and webinar series. I'm going to hand over to him momentarily. I'll just say first that after our panel have spoken, I will return to moderate questions from the audience, from all of you watching this. So you can ask those questions by writing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you can do that throughout the presentation as the questions come to you, and I'll collect those and ask a select few at the end of the presentation. Okay, I'm very happy to hand over to Tash Burnton and thank him again for all his help and all his assistance and for the many philanthropic efforts that his family are involved in support of Israel. Tash Burnton, thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, I'd like to welcome everybody listening in the United States and Israel and other locations, and also very much to wish those celebrating a happy Passover coming up. A few housekeeping notes before I introduce our distinguished panelists for this part 2 of our conflict resolution seminar from the Hidden Light Institute on Middle East peace treaties. First, I'd like to mention that the webinars are recorded and available on the events landing page. And also very much to wish those celebrating a happy Passover. Yeah, I've got an echo here, but if the webinar crashes, please use the link that you've been provided to sign back on. The Hidden Light Institute was formed with the purpose of educating individuals about Jewish leaders and historical events through documentary films and programming like our webinars and symposiums related to Menachem Begin and his lasting legacy. And the Begin Symposium specifically, which was planned in partnership with the Hidden Light Institute and the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, is an international convocation focusing on the leadership of Menachem Begin and his impact to the Jewish world, both in Israel and the diaspora. And we support and appreciate the support of leadership, supporters, and contributors to these efforts. The Begin webinar series provides monthly programming throughout COVID on a variety of topics relating to Begin's legacy. And please note that our May symposium in Jerusalem has been rescheduled as an online event for June 6, 2021, which is coinciding with the 40th anniversary of Operation Opera, which was the bombing of the Osirak nuclear reactor. Throughout his life, Begin's ability to negotiate and resolve conflicts truly set him apart from other leaders. In his early days as a Zionist champion, through the leadership of the Irgun and his role as a minority leader in the Knesset, he demonstrated the unique ability to resolve conflicts. And we are joined by a distinguished faculty that direct leading conflict resolution programs at their respective universities to discuss the theory, practice, and lessons for the future from this very important subject matter. First, I'd like to introduce Andrea Kupfer Schneider, who is a professor of law at Marquette University Law School, where she has taught dispute resolution, negotiation, ethics, and international conflict resolution for over 20 years. She is the director of Marquette Law School's dispute resolution program, and last year became the inaugural director of the Marquette's new Institute for Women's Leadership. She frequently publishes law review articles and book chapters on negotiation, gender, international conflict, and dispute systems design, and has co-authored several leading legal textbooks on alternative dispute resolution, negotiation, and mediation, and was named 2009 Woman of the Year by the Wisconsin Law Journal. She was also named the 2017 recipient of the ABA Section of Dispute Resolution Award for Outstanding Scholarly Work. Robert Mnookin is the Samuel Willison Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, and for 25 years served as the chair of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. He directs the Harvard Negotiation Research Project. I sense a theme here with Harvard. A leading scholar in the field of conflict resolution. The professor has applied his interdisciplinary approach to negotiation and conflict resolution to a remarkable range of programs, both public and private. And he's taught numerous workshops for corporations, government agencies, and law firms. On behalf of the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva, he designed and has taught annual workshops for intellectual property professors. And as a neutral arbitrator and mediator, he has resolved numerous complex commercial disputes. The professor has written or edited 10 books and numerous scholarly articles, with most recent books including Kissinger, The Negotiation, and The Jewish American Paradox, Embracing Choice in a Changing World, and finally, Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate and When to Fight, which is something I suspect we all might benefit from. David Matz, our final panelist, has been active in conflict resolution for over 30 years, mediating, training, and teaching. He served as director of the Graduate Program in Dispute Resolution at the University of Massachusetts, Boston from 1986 until 2010, and has been on faculty as a law professor since 1973. In 1989 to 90, David served as Fulbright Professor of Law at the University of Tel Aviv. David has served on panels for the Superior Courts of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Office of Dispute Resolution and Environmental Panel, the American Arbitration Association Employers Dispute Panel. He's mediated a variety of cases with particular emphasis on commercial, employment, healthcare, and family disputes. David has designed mediation systems for the Superior Courts in Suffolk, Norfolk, and Middlesex counties, and has been consultant to the Chief Justice of the High Court and the Ministry of Justice of Israel. And his work is focused on development of mediation and other alternative dispute resolution techniques for use in the Israeli courts. And in Israel, he has trained numerous judges, attorneys, executives, and mediators. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished panel and look forward with all of you to hearing what they have to say.
Thank you so much, Tash. We are very excited to be here. I want to thank the Begin Heritage Center and the Hidden Light Foundation for bringing us together, and Paul and Tash for their individual work on this. This, as we've already said, is part 2 of our series on conflict resolution, and we are building on what we learned in session 1 to first understand what we learned about the basic principles of conflict resolution processes, and where do we go from here as we particularly try to understand the impact of Camp David and Menachem Begin on conflict resolution teaching and practice, and to build out the context for this. Finally, we're going to look at specific leadership challenges that were faced at Camp David, and then what lessons can we learn from Camp David and from Menachem Begin, leading all the way up to today's current leadership, whatever that is, after the elections. To do that, and I should note, we did schedule this prior to the election date, so this is good timing all around. To do all of this, we're going to start with Professor David Matz, who will discuss exactly what happened at Camp David and really focus his remarks there. I'll then turn to Professor Bob Mnookin, who will discuss what happened afterward, the real legacy of Menachem Begin from Camp David up to lessons for what's going on right now. We'll then have time for a round robin among the 3 of us to talk in particular about some of these challenges, and then open it up to Q&A from the audience. And with no further ado, David, I'm going to turn this over to you. David, sorry, you're still on mute.
There we go. Well, now I just, having done that though, I have lost my capacity to get back to my screen.
Well, I'm sure while you do that, you were eloquent. You made appropriate remarks about how fascinating this is going to be, how delighted you are to be here, and how much fun we should be looking forward to this.
You filled the space beautifully. I now have my notes. Thank you very much.
There you go.
So I started to say that I'm going to focus on the 13 days, though, of course, a lot of negotiating went on before and after. But it is fascinating to focus in on just the 13 days that occurred when Menachem Begin, Sadat, and Carter were all together at Camp David. The focus of today is Menachem Begin, but given the nature of what we're studying, it's not possible to talk about him except in connection with a very tense interaction for 13 days with Carter and Sadat. So I'm going to be bouncing back and forth from one view to the other. Roughly, I'm going to talk about what they did when they arrived, how they felt when they arrived, what tools, negotiating tools they used, and what changed their minds while they were at Camp David. So when they arrived, Menachem Begin made all the signs that he did not want to negotiate at all, that he did not want to reach a deal at all. He came pretty clearly intending to just get through what he took to be 2 or 3 days of working with Jimmy Carter, but he intended to do nothing about settlements in the Sinai. He intended to do nothing about the Palestinians. And from a practical political point of view, he didn't need a deal. Most interestingly, he did not come prepared to negotiate in the usual way. There wasn't a lot of preparation, maps, documents, fallbacks. None of that was in his notebook. So he clearly came with that in mind, with one factual exception. He brought a very interesting team with him. He brought Dayan, Weizmann, and Barak, our own Barak, with him, which was not the most likely group to bring if the goal was to make no deal. This was a group that at least individually had worked with various of the Arab partners, and particularly Egypt, and one might have thought would be more open to possible deals. Interesting question as to why he brought them as a staff. An important thing to remember is that this occurred, of course, not long after Sadat had visited Jerusalem. And there was a great deal of pressure on Begin to somehow be responsive to that, particularly with regard to the fact that the Americans were so enthused, President Carter was so enthused about what Sadat had done, that it put Begin in the position of having to work hard to get back and stay in good favor with Carter. Sadat had made a lot of progress in building a relationship with Carter, and Begin clearly felt that this was a kind of competition for Carter and the US support and a sense of favor. Sadat came to the process wanting to make a deal, very much would like a deal to get the Sinai, the full Sinai back without settlements. He was very much in the mood to get some kind of a payoff for the high risk he took for his Jerusalem trip. So he either wanted the deal, and I should point out that while he was very clear about wanting both settlements and some progress toward self-government for the Palestinians, he let it be known that he had a priority as between those two issues, and that the settlement removal was the higher one. He was also, however, quite aware that he might not get a deal. Indeed, he sort of figured he wouldn't get a deal, but he had a fallback, and that was to improve his relationship with Jimmy Carter. He wanted some form of, as I said, payback for having gone to Jerusalem, and he was hoping that he could capitalize on that in building with his relationship with Carter. Carter came somewhat differently. First, his staff had said to him, don't do this. Do not go to Camp David. It's a disaster. It'll never work. You'll never get an agreement. And he overruled the staff, which becomes an important psychological piece for him as the 13 days unfold. He had an atmosphere, an attitude at the beginning of all he really had to do was bring these guys together, explain why they needed to reach a deal, set up a very nice atmosphere, and they would work it out. Now, I have to say that's a mystery to me. I don't understand why he thought so. He had lots of playbooks. He had lots of background. He had prepared assiduously for this negotiation, and came with a rather strange attitude that it was going to be relatively easy, that he would be in the terms of our business, he would be more of a facilitator, less of a mediator. I said that Begin was happy not to get an agreement. Sadat had worked it out for himself that he could live without an agreement. Carter needed an agreement. His presidency was in trouble. He was working against his own staff, which was a very professional, very skilled staff, whom he respected highly. He had come to this, he had to sort of prove that he really could get an agreement. And it is said over and over, and he says it in his book, and it is said elsewhere, that he really did believe in his divine role. He really felt that he had a calling to help this peace come about, and he was going to do everything he could to make it happen. as days passed, 1 day, 2 day, 5 day, 10 day, more and more pressure on him to get a deal because there's been that much more vested in this process, and he better come home with something. He also had some concern for the substantive outcomes. He wanted the settlements out, he wanted the Sinai returned, and he really believed strongly in self-government for the Palestinians. So he was not completely unrelated to the issues themselves. Let's talk a little bit about some of the dynamics that were going on during these 13 days. I think if we start with Menachem Begin, it's worth noting that in those 13 days, if you simply talk to various people there, Menachem Begin was something of the villain in this piece. He was seen as rigid, compulsive about details, sanctimonious. He wanted a good relationship with Jimmy Carter, but he didn't put forward an enormous amount of energy to make that happen. He kept trying to be nice to Carter, but in ways that Carter did not wind up appreciating. So that the chemistry between them was tense on its best days. Sadat, conversely, seeing a great opportunity for himself, played up to Carter endlessly. And basically at one point said to him, basically, here's all I want. I'll sign anything you want me to sign. Begin and Sadat hardly saw each other after the first 2 days. So that fundamentally the dynamic of negotiation was each of them, Begin and Sadat, negotiated with Carter, not with each other. And it was a negotiation. He was mediating, but he was basically negotiating with each one. If you look at the dialogues over the 13 days, who said what to whom, who was talking, what were the memos, excuse me, what you see is that while they start out talking about the settlements and the Palestinians, the ratio changes. The settlements become much more prominent in conversation, the Palestinians less so. That, of course, turns up as we get toward the end. If we look at some of the tools that they used, the negotiating tools, Menachem Begin used, if one wants to frame it this way, really only one tool, and that was, he said, I'm not moving. He was stolid, he was serious, and he kept making the arguments for why he didn't need to do anything. That is a negotiating strategy, and he certainly used it. Sadat's strategy, in large measure, was to keep being nice to Carter, keep being nice to Carter. It was Carter who made the first major change. He came to Camp David, as I said, hoping that he could finish up by letting them do the work. By the end of day 3, he concluded that was a disastrous strategy. It wasn't going to work. And he went from 0 to 60 almost overnight. He put in enormous amounts of energy aimed at both men, both Begin and Sadat. He was perfectly willing to use threats having to do with personal relationships, national relationships. He did things, the word bribery is a little harsh in this context, but he certainly made offers. He threatened each one that he was going to work with the other, which was a very serious threat for both Sadat and Begin. He threatened to go public and blame each of them. He set, of course, a deadline. Each of these are very heavy things coming in any situation, certainly from the President of the United States. An interesting move that Carter made was that about halfway through, he decided that he could do better working with the staff, mainly Begin's staff, but also Sadat. And he began meeting with them, rather bluntly going around the leadership. Interestingly, both Begin and Sadat, but particularly Begin, seemed okay with that. Many a leader would not be very thrilled with that, but he seemed okay. And so Carter and his staff began working much more intensely with the staff who had come along, with Begin particularly. It is said, talking about techniques, that Carter used the single text approach. That is, he drafted a document, he'd take it to one side, ask them to make a change, and then take it to the other side, get a buy-in from them, go back and forth, making small changes as he goes. That's true. But he did something that's not in the textbooks, and that is that he used a single text as a club. Carter was very, very tough when he'd go in about changes and why they needed to accept these changes. One major issue, which was not planned for, was not in anybody's background book, but became central, and that is Carter had to work to keep both Begin and Sadat there. Both of them wanted to leave. Sadat rather dramatically walked out, fully packed, had the whole staff ready, standing under a helicopter, ready to go. We don't know whether that was his sense of drama or whether he was really on the way out the door, but he did. He put in a lot of effort to get them to stay, which is to say he put a lot of weight on stamina. We are going to stay here till we get this finished. He would not let them quit. He never said when there was going to be a deadline. There was no objective deadline out there as there was, let's say, for President Clinton some years later. He worked at the process of keeping them, and not letting them go. Now, not letting them go is a little harsh. Any one of them could have gotten up and left. They didn't leave, and that is the important piece of that. All three made changes during the process. Carter, as I say, went full bore from being a facilitative, relatively passive sort up to a full bore, heavy-duty mediator. Sadat made one major change. He got the settlement solution that he was looking for. He had been insisting on a major set of changes for the Palestinians. He got almost none of that, and he accepted it. He understood that he wasn't going to get that. That was a process of, in some ways, what negotiation is good at. You explore, hoping the other side will be able to give you something, and he finally decided he wasn't going to get any better. The big change, of course, was from Menachem Begin, when he made the decision to remove the settlements. Why did he make that big change? There are people who think that he made that change before he came to Camp David. There is no particular sign of that. But what made the change? Well, 11 days of Jimmy Carter jumping on him certainly had some effect. The notion that he could lose his closeness with the United States was an enormously serious problem for Begin, and the threat of that he came to take very, very seriously. His own staff was putting pressure on him, trying to do it in the form of making it more acceptable, lots of tinkering with various documents, with wording. But it was very clear to him that most of his staff thought he ought to be moving in the direction of removing the settlements. Somewhere in about the third or fourth day, someone made the suggestion that they get Arik Sharon, who was then the agriculture minister, was not at Camp David, get him to sort of approve of the removal of settlements. Sharon, of course, was largely involved with other settlements, was seen as a great champion of settlements, and was a major political player. Although that was known and was discussed, it wasn't brought to the surface until about day 11 or 12, when someone called Sharon and said, do you approve? Do you think this is okay? And Sharon said, yes, this is not a security problem. The settlements in the Sinai are not a problem, and we can deal with that. That was a big statement politically. There were a couple of other adjustments. The decision was made, Begin basically made the decision that he would not decide about the settlement removal, but he would give it to the Knesset, and that he would allow conscience voting, not party voting. That was a major step. The last thing I want to point to is that Camp David demonstrated an enormously important dynamic in the Middle East generally, certainly in that negotiation, but it's played out beyond. And that is the Americans and other Arab countries wanted very much to help the Palestinians, but they wanted a workable relationship with Israel more. And when push came to shove, the Palestinians were shoved. They were moved out of the way. And a lot of the negotiating that's gone on since has been the Palestinians trying to get back on the center stage, get treated as number one, when much of the rest of the world taking them seriously, but not as serious as other issues. I think I'll leave it there and let Bob pick it up from here.
Perfect. Thanks so much, David. And Bob, I will turn this over to you. And you're on mute as well.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll see if I can successfully share my screen. What I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes is focus on using negotiation concepts to explore the persistence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which of course did not get resolved. It was really kind of deferred at Camp David. And to that end, I really want to focus primarily on the question of whether there's a two-state deal that would better serve the interests of most Israelis and most Palestinians than continued conflict. Now, in some ways, what's clear is that efforts to promote a two-state deal in the years since Prime Minister Begin succeeded in negotiating a deal with Egypt have all failed. There, of course, have been the Oslo Accords, and President Clinton at a second Camp David summit failed in his efforts to secure a deal between Prime Minister Barak and Yasser Arafat. And the Taba negotiations thereafter didn't work either. Efforts by George W. Bush's administration, somehow, forgive me, administration in terms of the roadmap for peace and the letter to Prime Minister Sharon relating to the facts on the ground after the evacuation of Gaza, or as part of the evacuation of Gaza, and the Annapolis Conference and the Israeli-Palestinian talks in 2007, 2008 also failed, although those talks probably came the closest of ever reaching an agreement. The Obama administration made two efforts involving America.
Yes, Andrea, I'm just going to scooch in for a second. The screen is not showing your slides, so I can't tell if you are advancing.
The screen is not showing my slides.
No, we see you, but otherwise it is like, there we go.
You now, but this is
now see slides. Yep, perfect, thanks. Whoop, now it's black again.
Okay, let me go back. So you can see the slides now?
Yes.
It's not presentation view on my screen though, but I'll move ahead. I'll move ahead anyway. Okay. Anyway, to continue, the efforts in George W. Bush's administration to mediate also failed, although I think the Israelis and the Palestinians came closer then than they've ever gotten since towards a deal. And during the Obama administration, there were two efforts, one involving George Mitchell and Secretary Clinton in 2010-11, which came to nothing. And then finally, Secretary Kerry, of course, made considerable efforts to mediate in 2013 and 2014, and those failed. And finally, President Trump did a number of things, including recognizing Israel's Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, And he also put forward a peace to prosperity vision and proposal, which was viewed by many as being extraordinarily favorable to the Israelis. And there were the Abrahamic Accords that involved Bahrain and others recognizing Israel. But notwithstanding all these activities, there, of course, were no further negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, some view this as paradoxical because an interesting question is there a two-state deal that, in fact, would better serve the long-run interests of Israelis and Palestinians than continued conflict? And I must confess that I think many American analysts have long believed that such a deal, probably basically involving what are called the Clinton parameters, would so serve both sides. And there, in fact, has been polling data of both Palestinians and Israelis suggesting that, more than 50%, 50 or 60% of Israelis and of Palestinians would, in fact, approve of such a deal. And yet it hasn't happened. But in all events, I think the first question really is there a possible deal? And what I want to do is frame this in terms of initially some basic negotiation concepts. And let me just offer three. One, the core question that negotiation analysts always ask is there a negotiated deal that better serves a party's interest than their best alternative away from the table? If they say no, what can they be confident of? And the BATNA, that's a jargonish term that was made popular by my colleagues, Fisher, Urey, and Patton, means the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And the suggestion is before you go into any negotiation, you really have to think through what are your alternatives if negotiations fail. There's always uncertainty about that, but you've got to assess it. And what a rational actor would, of course, do is compare the value of that best alternative to the possible deal you could get at the table. The reservation value is what negotiation analysts characterize as essentially, it's sometimes called one's bottom line. At the table, what is the least you'd accept or the most you would offer? And the idea that negotiation analysts often play with is they ask the question, do we think there is a zone of possible agreement? When we consider what the parties' alternatives are, is there a zone where, in fact, we think both parties might be better off? Let me give you a very simple example. Assume I have a 2018 Honda Accord that I want to sell. And assume my best alternative is to sell it to a dealer if I can't make a deal with some private party for $17,000. Assume that my buddy David Matz is interested, likes the Honda CR-Vs, and is interested in getting one. And assume his best alternative to buying my Honda is to buy a new Honda for $26,000. Well, if I'm asking $19,000 for my Honda, which is, of course, $2,000 more than a dealer would pay me, the question is, should David buy it or not? Well, it depends on what his reservation value is. If he buys a new one, that has certain advantages. He might decide that, well, he'd really be willing to go up to $20,000. Well, what a negotiation analyst would say in this case, there's a zone of possible agreement. Any deal for more than $17,000, which is what the value of my BATNA, and more and less than $19,000, which is the reservation value for David, because he could otherwise buy a new Honda, would make both of us better off. okay? And so in this little example, there is a zone of possible agreement. Now, that doesn't mean that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there necessarily is a zone. But I think one key and very obvious notion from negotiation analytics is if there's no zone of possible agreement that can make both parties better off than their alternatives, we shouldn't expect a deal. And one question, of course, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is there such a zone? I happen to think there probably is, but I could be wrong. And there's certainly uncertainty about that. The more important point that I want to go on to, though, is even if there is such a deal that potentially could make both parties better off, in terms of negotiation analytics, we have, in fact, developed theories about why negotiations may nonetheless fail. There are all kinds of reasons negotiations could otherwise fail. And I guess what I'd next like to do is go through what some of these other barriers are, okay? First, there's what we call a strategic barrier. And that is, even if they're two rational actors, both David and I want to get the best deal for ourselves. Neither of us know for sure what the bottom line of the other party would be. And if we engage in hard bargaining, where I say to David, for example, take it or leave it, I want 20,000. He could quite rationally say no. And indeed, he might say, looking for a real bargain, I'm not going to buy your car. I'll otherwise buy a new car, even though, unless you'll sell it to me for 16,000. Now, we're both claiming more than we might ultimately really be willing to do. But when parties engage in hard bargaining like this, negotiations often break down. And the desire to maximize the benefits for yourself may often lead to the use of threats and other hard bargaining tactics that result in a negotiation failure, even when there is a zone of possible agreement. So, okay, that's the first reason negotiations can fail. And what I can assure you is anyone who has studied the history of negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians know that both sides are quite expert at engaging in hard bargaining and all kinds of strategic behavior. So that's one reason it could fail. Another reason negotiations can fail is what is called by a cognitive psychologist a self-serving bias. There have been all kinds of experiments that show when you're a partisan and involved in negotiations, you often exaggerate the strength of your own arguments and your ability to really control things. And in fact, there have been experiments where, for example, participants in negotiation exercises have essentially, not knowing it, but given them the same basic facts. And they ask each side before they go into negotiations, what do you think is the probability of your winning if the negotiations fail and you have to go to court? Well, you give them the same information about what the precedents are and what a court might or might not do. And what we discover, of course, is generally the lawyers representing plaintiffs end up believing they have a much higher chance of winning than the representative of defendants think, even though both have the same facts. There's also, of course, the reality that when you're representing a particular side, you're always looking for those things that you think are going to benefit yourself, and you're going to put more weight on those and less on what the other side might be doing. But the effect of a self-serving bias is if parties are too optimistic about how good their alternatives are away from the table, or the probability of favorable outcomes, they may end up reaching an impasse, even though there is a potential deal that could make them both better off. The next idea is one that's probably less familiar to you, but it's called reactive devaluation. Reactive devaluation is a concept that we have developed in the negotiation domain to describe the fact that often when an adversary makes an offer to you, in other words, they're making a presentation, they're offering you something, a deal that previously might have been with one that could have been acceptable to you will often be devalued simply by the identity of the person making the offer. I mean, for example, this is the idea, I'm not saying this has happened, that the Palestinians would offer an element of a deal might lead some Israelis who previously would have thought that was attractive to say, they must know something we don't know. If they're offering it to us, there've got to be problems with it. If an adversary has what's called a zero-sum mindset, and they think that, in fact, anything that's good for one party can't be good for the other, they may devalue offers by their adversary, even though previously they would have thought it was okay. I'll give you an example. When I was a practicing lawyer, I had a case where a client said to me, good God, if I could ever get X out of this case, if the defendant would ever pay me $30,000, I'd settle in a minute. Well, the lawyer for the other side calls me before I even have an opportunity to call him. And the lawyer on the other side offers to settle not for $30,000, but even a little better than that, $32,000. And I say to the other side, well, it's a serious offer. Let me take it back to my client. I take it back to my client who had previously said $30,000 would have been just fine. And my client says, they obviously know something we don't know. We can't accept it. And that would be an example of a reactive devaluation. The next idea, which I think is particularly prevalent in this dispute, is what is called loss aversion. Kahneman and Tversky have demonstrated that when people frame something as a loss, they're often willing to gamble to avoid a loss in a way that they wouldn't be willing to gamble in order to pursue a gain. One striking feature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that a resolution of a two-state resolution along the lines of the Clinton parameter, in fact, involves what could be characterized as substantial losses for some Israelis and some Palestinians. I mean, for example, for those Israelis who are committed to the idea of Eretz Israel, where they want essentially all or nearly all of the West Bank to be included in terms of Israel, any two-state resolution is giving up something that they view as a terrible loss. For Palestinians who believe in a right of return, where they believe they have a right to return to where they had lived before 48 or before 67, any resolution is not going to involve hundreds of thousands or much less millions of Palestinians moving back to Israel. So they're essentially going to have a right perhaps to return to a new Palestinian state, but not to grandma's house in Haifa. And that too would be perceived as a loss. Now, even though both sides might have gains, I think the key point is this two-state resolution would involve what would be perceived as losses by many. And that makes it particularly hard to accept. The last point, and I think it's the one that I view as most important, is, and this is something I've done a lot of work on over the years, apart from any negotiation across the table between, for example, Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority, there are negotiations behind the table. And my own view is that the internal conflicts within Israel, on the one hand, and the internal conflicts among Palestinians on the other, make the leadership demands enormous in terms of pursuing a two-state resolution. And in fact, in terms of the conflicts, I mean, given that the difficulties of forming governments within Israel, it's pretty conspicuous, how substantial these internal conflicts are among Israeli Jews. And among Palestinians, of course, in some ways, there's even a more profound conflict, because if you think about the positions of Hamas on the one hand and the Palestinian Authority on the other, they're deeply, deeply divided. Well, what this means, of course, is that for a leader, a political leader, this process is extremely risky and difficult. And I think, indeed, one thing Prime Minister Begin did is, although he deferred to the Knesset, his willingness to take that chance and to give up settlements in his deal with Egypt involved extraordinarily courageous acts of a leader. And it's not clear in recent years there have been leaders courageous enough on either side to take the political chances of doing it. How much time do I have left, Andrea?
I'm giggling because you don't, but,
okay.
But because you've asked nicely, I'm going to let you wrap up with this. That's terrific. Thank you.
All right. Well, I thought you might be at least amused by my own predictions about the Biden administration policy, because we have a new government in the United States. And I think that my own strong beliefs are President Biden will not reverse Trump's decision on Jerusalem or the Golan Heights, even though it certainly would not have been something that a Biden administration would have done had it been in power. Second, I think it's clear that the Biden administration is going to support the Abrahamic Accords that also took place during the Trump administration. Third, the Biden administration has already signaled that it wishes to renew aid to the Palestinians and wants to reestablish relations with the Palestinians. You'll recall that President Trump cut off aid, both direct and indirect, from the United States, and really had ended negotiations with the Palestinians. I think that Biden is certainly going to oppose any move of the Israelis towards annexation, and it may be because the Abrahamic Accords, that's off the table anyway. But clearly, I think the United States would take very firm action to avoid annexation. I think that Biden is going to oppose BDS within the United States, is going to try to restrain settlement expansion, but I'm not sure how much they'll in fact do to restrain it. And I think the other thing that's clear to me is they're going to reaffirm support for a two-state resolution. Trump at one point indicated he didn't care whether it was one state or two states, as long as the parties could kind of get along. I don't think that's true for the Biden administration. And I think that the other thing I am confident of is that in the short run, the Biden administration is not going to push for the resumptions of talks between the Israelis and Palestinians directed towards a two-state resolution. I think this is true for two reasons. One is, frankly, I don't think it's viewed as a top foreign policy priority anymore by the administration. Negotiations with Iran, North Korea, we're much more worried about China and Russia now. So I think the level of importance has shrunk. And I think there's also a perception that there's an absence of leadership on either side that is really motivated or has the capacity to make a two-state deal. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Bob. Terrific. What we're going to do is have a little bit of time for a round robin among the three of us, and we'll have, I'd say, about 10 minutes for that, and then we'll open it for questions. So please do put those in the Q&A or in the chat, and Paul will be monitoring that as we're continuing. David, I'm going to turn this back to you. It was interesting to hear, on the one hand, how Bob has described how hard bargaining is typically a strategic barrier. We think that negotiators who are too hard, too tough, too competitive, too aggressive are going to have negative responses. And we envision that mediation, on the other hand, is a more cooperative, problem-solving kind of approach. But what you described was actually Jimmy Carter being the quintessential hard bargainer in the pursuit of mediation. And I'm wondering, is that a contradiction, a paradox, or that is actually really good mediation? And we should get over this distinction of you've got to be cooperative to mediate.
There we go. I think I would frame it as a critique of our field. That is, that I think a great deal of successful bargaining, we would label hard bargaining with the pejorative overtone of hard bargaining. Right. This is simply a lovely example of it, but there are many. Our field is not prone to study the hard bargaining situations, so we don't have a lot of really good case examples of that. But this is an example in which the hard bargaining was, and it wasn't just Carter. I mean, I think that Begin was, one could argue that Begin was hard bargaining from day one. He knew exactly what he wanted to do, and he was going to give in on the last minute. That's a perfectly, that fits not all the facts, but enough of them to make that a reasonable interpretation. He knows hard bargaining. He knew that he would probably expect something like that from Carter, and didn't get anything terribly surprising from Sadat. And he was going to hold on, maybe hope he didn't have to give away on anything. Made a decision, I got to give away on the settlements, because that's what I've learned in my 13 days. When negotiations work well, they're learning enterprises. And that's one of the big deals. What's the best deal I can get? And since he really needed Carter's support, he figured I'd better yield on this one. And then he covered himself politically with Sharon and with others. But basically, he made the decision in what is quintessentially hard bargaining, I agree, on everybody's part. They were all there. And in that sense, if you want to call it so, it's a fair fight, in which they came out with what has to be pointed out. It's pointed out many times. It's an agreement that's lasted over 40 years in a very, very difficult setting. So somebody's got to say something good about the process leading to that conclusion.
Right. Good. Both of you talked about.
Could I add one thing? First, I completely agree. I was not trying to say that someone should never engage in hard bargaining. I was simply pointing out it involves risks. And the risk is the negotiation could break down, even though there's a potential deal that could make you and the other side better off. The second thing, and I also want to agree with David on this, is no one's ever thought the United States was neutral. The United States as a mediator has interests of its own. And in fact, we're also, the reason Palestinians accept the United States as a quote mediator is not because they think we're neutral, but they think we can in fact perhaps influence the Israelis, and no one else perhaps can as well. And so Jimmy Carter and the United States typically is a mediator with muscle. And the United States typically acting as mediators in this situation tries to use its influence in terms of both carrots and sticks to influence the parties. But there are limits to our capacity to do that. And I think what's striking is how often since then the United States has been deeply involved with presidential capital put on the line sometimes, and how it never succeeded.
Andrea, could I toss in one more sentence? Can you stop me? I think the contrast, building on Bob's point, that Camp David II, which had a certain structural similarity, we have a president who is mediating between, et cetera, I think the critique of Camp David II is they didn't learn enough from Camp David I. That Camp David II looked a lot more like our textbooks and had a lot of the similar techniques that we teach, which is to say not hard bargaining. And both, well, Clinton and his team were very hesitant to put on the kind of pressure that Carter put on. And I don't know, it's a little oversimple to say, and therefore there was no agreement, but there was no agreement. One never can predict how these things are going to go, or even retrospectively how they would have gone. But nonetheless, I think the contrast in mediator role is really striking. And when you tie it to result, at least it raises some interesting questions about whether it could have been done in a hard bargaining way and gotten a better result.
Right. And David, I know you've written about the Camp David II as well in terms of who you bring to the table and your team. Both of you have written about the internal negotiations, who's showing up at Camp David or Taba in particular, and then really the negotiation, Bob, as you put it, behind the table. And so one of the interesting things, you know, that always struck me, Menachem Begin bringing Aharon Barak with him, who's the Attorney General, right? It's a really interesting, like, who are you bringing and why are they part of your team? And, you know, we tend to think of negotiations as our Secretary of State, your foreign minister, or people who are experts in maps or, you know, economic exchanges, right? You have your trade ministers. And so, and both of you, I mean, I'd really like to hear of, in thinking about the lessons, again, from Camp David, but then also what did or did not work later on, have the Israelis and Palestinians, did they also not learn or make mistakes in terms of who they brought with them when they were actually sitting down to negotiate? And is that, again, one of those behind the table leadership challenges in one way or another? So.
I'll start, just take a minute. I think Barak is a lovely example of the least likely person to bring. Weitzman, Dayan, they're major players, major figures, whoever heard. Now, he was the Attorney General on his way to the Supreme Court at the time that he was asked to come. So he was the bright young man in government.
Right,
but that's hardly a qualification.
Law school, which qualifies you for all sorts of things. So.
Oh, and as a professor, I mean, certainly. But he was brought for the best of all possible reasons because he's a really smart man. And he was used at Camp David exactly that way. He stood up at various moments and said, have you thought about it this way? And everybody said, no, we have not. That's really interesting. And he did that a number of times. Famously, Carter at one point said, any chance I can put you on the US Supreme Court? That is, he was just really smart at stepping back and seeing the whole picture, not as a politician, although he was a very political guy, but was able to step back. Who came to the table in subsequent negotiations, Camp David I, Taba, and at other times, is enormously important, partly on the Palestinian side, because although they had enormously competent people, very well-trained people, the leadership of the government didn't pay much attention to them. So there was a real gap between leadership and staff, which was also true at Camp David, by the way. Camp David won, but it didn't make as much difference. That was one issue. No other leader, to my knowledge, has brought along people at the caliber that Begin did. He didn't bring people at that stature. And these are people who could go home and hold their own press conferences and get a lot of attention as to what happened there. And that's not usually the way it's done. So choosing staff is important for symbolic reasons. It's important for how much freedom you have when you get to the table. It's important because they just see things and know things you can't. And they put pressure on you and you're willing to listen. Interestingly, Begin, notoriously stubborn, did listen to his staff. Took a few days, but he did listen. He was paying attention, which is why when Jimmy Carter figured that out, he started talking to staff. He figured that's how I get to Begin, and he was right. On the Egyptian side, Sadat didn't listen. I mean, he listened to his staff. He liked them, but he wasn't influenced particularly. He was his own man, top, middle, and bottom.
Bob, thoughts about the behind the table leadership challenges?
Well, in Camp David II, I think what's clear is that there was one decision maker that counted on the Palestinian side, and that was Yasser Arafat. And I think the United States ultimately had very little leverage over Yasser Arafat. I think, David suggests that we didn't bargain hard enough. I don't think there was any way for us to have gotten Arafat to accept the deal. In part, by the way, because I think the Arafat's perception, which may have been correct, the Palestinians were very skeptical that Prime Minister Barak would be able to implement a deal because it was at the very end of his term. So in many ways, there were lots of things wrong at Camp David II. Another striking feature of Camp David II is the amount of time that Arafat and Barak were together negotiating was about zero. It was all shuttle diplomacy. I think that was a terrible mistake. There was more progress made at Taba, but at Taba, I've been told that in fact, one of the Israeli negotiators was asked to explain to Arafat what had been tentatively not decided upon, but moved towards, because the Palestinian staff didn't want the responsibility of explaining it, which sort of shows a little bit about that relationship.
Great. Yep. All right, let me turn this over to Paul to bring in the rest of our audience.
Okay, thank you all very much for some fascinating insights and real great overviews of what I know could be sort of whole semesters of teaching and seminars. Okay, there's a few questions here. Let's start with this one, and I think both of you will have a view on it. Simply put, how do we see the conflict? I assume he means the Israeli-Palestinian conflict impacting current engagements with other Arab countries, other attempts by Israel to forge relations. I mean, the most significant but potential one is Saudi Arabia.
Which I think raises the question Bob rightly raised about what role will the United States play. That's the place where I think if Biden and his team want to do something, that's the way to do it. To work through the deals with the Abrahamic possibilities, including Saudi Arabia, and somehow, and I say somehow because I don't quite know how it's got to be done, somehow put a condition on that if they're going to make a deal, go further with Israel, that it has to take account of Palestinian needs. So I think there's room there. There are people who are interested. There are people who've sketched it out. As Bob says, it's all high-risk stuff. You're never guaranteed of anything at all. But I think there's room there to work. But if it's not going to come from the outside, it's not going to come from the inside. And right now, I think the Europeans are less likely to play much of a role. So I think it's all going to be back to Biden and his team. Rob Malley, who is at least a long-time experienced player and a relevant player, certainly sees how that would be done. But there are only so many chips a president can play. And Mr. Biden has a lot of things he's got to get done. Whether he's going to want to invest in this one, I think the issue is just time and energy. And that's where my skepticism would come, Bob, that he just is going to be too busy to really want to go to work. How the Secretary of State's going to allocate his time, I don't really know.
I think that you framed it in a useful way if you're thinking about the American administration, and that is, how will they want to invest their political capital and energy? And I think in the Middle East, the priority now, there are three priorities that dominate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first is with Iran. And what the United States wants to do there is going to create tensions with both the Saudis and the Israelis. Because, in fact, the United States wants to renegotiate the deal. And I think that there's great reluctance both within Israel and among the Saudis to see that happen. A second possible priority is we'd like to dampen the conflict in Yemen. But I think that also is of greater status. And the third, of course, is we're not out of Afghanistan yet. And for domestic purposes, I think Biden would very much like to figure out how to do that. That's leaving to one side our concerns about China and Russia. So I think that this is not a very high priority. And like David, I don't think the American president, I wouldn't advise him to invest much capital in it, because I think Kerry invested an enormous amount of capital. I don't think Obama did, but Kerry did, and it came to naught.
Okay.
I'll just say one last piece on this. I also think that there's the possibility that the Muslim countries themselves perhaps raise this over history, when there's been trouble on the street, as it were, or to divert attention from what's happening domestically. Some of these countries have gotten kudos for protecting the Palestinians. And so that's another avenue that it could be raised, not from the United States, not from the Israelis, not even from the Palestinians, but from some of these countries who would like to divert their own public from what's going on at home.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great point as well. A question. There's a question about the Trump plan, the so-called deal of the century, which is, as Professor Mnookin said, was markedly more favorable to Israel's concerns than Palestinian concerns, or certainly more so than previous peace offers. Question is, and obviously this is more focused at Professor Mnookin's presentation, but I'm sure Professor Matz also has much to add to this. The Palestinians rejected it out of hand, as was maybe expected. But could they have played it better, even though it had things in it which were anathema to them, like settlements remaining in place and Jerusalem not being divided? Was there a way they could have used it as a starting point for future negotiations rather than the end result, as they sort of just pushed it aside and said, we don't want to have anything to do with this?
Let me add a word on that, because I think it's a very interesting question. And I don't want to say the Palestinians were wrong to reject it during the Trump administration, but I think the Trump proposal and vision is terribly important for the following reason. I think it represents a two-state deal that would be acceptable to the center right in Israel. In other words, I think that what Trump ended up doing is putting on the table a deal that would sort of make it as safe as possible for someone who is right but not too far right to make a deal. And if the Palestinians viewed it in that way, they could have perhaps thought about how could it be modified to make it more acceptable to us. Now, I'm not sure in terms of their ultimate reservation values, there could be further changes, but I think it's really important for that reason, not because of what it says about the Trump administration's perception of what might be acceptable to Israel. I don't think they took into account at all what might be acceptable to Palestinians. They never talked to them in developing the plan. But I think that to that extent, I think it remains relevant.
I would agree. And I think that the current relevance, I think the one reason they didn't respond was simply that they felt the world was ganging up on them. I mean, everybody was beating the hell out of them, and why go into a negotiation when everybody is against you? That is a route that would be more open, depending on Biden, depending on the Secretary of State, et cetera. That's still there to be opened. Now, a lot will depend on how we count votes today in Tel Aviv, and who's in charge and what have you. And certainly the direction of things in the Israeli government does not give a lot of promise to looking towards such a negotiation from the government point of view. But this is a long-term thing, and I think it would be wise of the Palestinians to at least frame it as, under these circumstances, we could talk. But they've got their own troubles, they've got their own transitions, their own governmental issues. My guess is it's not going to happen for internal reasons to the Palestinians, never mind all the other stuff that Bob has laid out.
Okay.
I think we have time for one more question, Andrea. Is that good?
That would work.
Okay, so let's turn to a topic which hasn't really been touched on, which is Gaza. There's a question here from Len Vosen, who asks if Israel could have negotiated around Gaza in a different way that would have been productive in preventing all the subsequent attacks on Israel, or could Israel have been more strategic? Or looking back, should Israel have not given up the Strip? And I'll just add to that to make it relevant also to David Matz's presentation, the question as to whether Gaza was on the table at all at Camp David, because of course Gaza before 1967 was occupied by Egypt.
That one's easy. No, it was not on the table. Next question. No, that part, they did not get there. They had enough trouble focusing on a handful of settlements in the Sinai. This sort of going back over and recreating a negotiation and saying, could they have done it differently is sort of a quagmire. It's hard to know which piece you want to grab hold of. I basically think there are times when negotiation isn't the right way to go do it. And if you've got someone like Sharon in charge and he's going to bang the heads, sometimes that's what's necessary. I worry that a negotiation would have come to a stalemate. It would have given too much power to too many other players. It's back to, there was a question on the screen at some point. Aren't there a lot of other players in all of this that we're not taking account of? And the answer is yes. That is historically one of the major theoretical problems for reaching agreement. And that is sort of everybody in every part of the world thinks they got to say so and has a cousin who's going to tell them so. And I'm serious. I mean, I've got a whole bunch of stories from around the world where I keep finding people in the middle of Nigeria arguing about this conflict. And I'm sitting here saying, what? Why is this important? And they tell me why it's important. So yes, there are a lot of other players. And it's the sort of thing that makes a person in the negotiation business really nervous to start talking about yet more players. We can't do it with the few we have. But I think that Gaza, in my judgment, was done about as well as it could be done. Certainly one can always improve on it, but I think it was just as well as they did it.
Let me just add a couple words to that. First, I've actually written something about this. Gaza could not have been achieved through negotiations on either the Israeli side or the Palestinian side. Why? Because the Palestinians could not have negotiated only about Gaza. They would have had to include the West Bank, and Sharon, other than a couple little tokens, had no capacity to negotiate anything substantial about the West Bank. Second, the mistake that was made was not the negotiation, because I think withdrawing without bloodshed, 7,000 or 8,000 settlers was an enormous achievement. I think the mistakes were not enough attention was paid to, as sympathetically as possible, reabsorb those settlers after they were displaced. That was not handled very well. And second, the security forces should not have been drawn in quite the way they did. It would have been possible to end Israeli settlement in Gaza without, at the same time, giving up all security forces in Gaza. On balance, though, I think, in fact, it was wise for Israel to withdraw from Gaza. And in fact, because it diminished to a substantial degree their responsibility for more than 1 million Palestinians. And if it were occupied, they'd certainly have much more responsibility for that. And I don't think that's something that would, I could demonstrate that fact by the reality that at any time Israel wanted to, it could reoccupy Gaza. It's got the military capacity to do it. But they don't want to do it because A, it would cost lives, and B, I think they don't want the responsibility.
The last note I'll just add on Gaza is one also wonders leaders and how leaders matter. I mean, losing Rabin in 1994, we could all sit and say what would have, could have, should have had he stayed in power. And I think the same is with Sharon. I wonder if this was part of a staged way of negotiating. And this was, prior to the withdrawal, there was that debate. Do we negotiate? Not? Do we tie it to the West Bank or not? Knowing Sharon and the way he strategically mapped things out, my guess is this was only step one. And we'll never know what would have or could have been because of the stroke, and then the succeeding governments not really picking up or not, wanting to from that insight. So I think that's also a kind of an interesting point as well.
Great, yeah, leaders matter. Perhaps something that we in Israel are also contemplating at this point. Thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to benefit from your expertise and hear from you on this topic, which is so relevant, both in terms of learning the history of Israel in this region, but also the ever-present reality of Israel in the Middle East. So thank you very much to Andrea Schneider for so expertly moderating and adding your own important thoughts, and to David Matz and Robert Mnookin. Thank you very, very much. Thanks again to Dr. Tash Burnton for funding this and for introducing this. And I wish all our participants a Chag Pesach Sameach, and I will see you all again in a few weeks. Keep up to date with what we're doing on our website and our Facebook page, and I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.